More than 1,000 years before the story of Moses, a strikingly similar tale will be told about a baby abandoned on the river Euphrates. An orphan boy who would rise to become one of the most powerful rulers in human history. Birthed in secret, his mother, a high priestess in ancient Mesopotamia, forbidden from raising children, set her boy adrift in a basket, leaving his fate up to the gods. Taken in by a water-bearer, that boy would rise from the most humble of beginnings to form the very first empire the world has ever known. The Akkadians, 2334 to 2154 BCE. The first empire in history. The Akkadian Empire brought together the vast fractured lands of ancient Mesopotamia under the rule of one man. That ruler's name was Sargon of Akkad. Sargon rose from obscurity to become a cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, the Sumerian king of Kish, pouring wine for a man who held one of the most powerful thrones in the ancient world. Then Sargon had a dream. In it, the goddess Ishtar drowned King Ur-Zababa in a river of blood. When Ur-Zababa heard about the dream, he didn't laugh it off. He panicked. In the ancient world, a dream like that was often interpreted as prophecy, and a cupbearer who dreamed of your death was not a man you wanted anywhere near your cup. So Ur-Zababa decided to have him killed. He sent Sargon to deliver a clay tablet to Legal-Zagazi, the powerful king of Uruk. What Sargon didn't know, or perhaps did, was what was written on it. The tablet secretly requested that Legal-Zagazi kill the bearer upon his arrival. It is the oldest known written assassination order in history. A death warrant pressed into clay, carried unknowingly by the man it was meant to dispatch. The plot failed. Exactly how is unclear. The ancient texts are damaged precisely at the wrong moment, as history tends to be. But what we do know is that Sargon survived, and before long, he had turned on Ur-Zababa, taken Kish for himself, and then kept going. He eventually allied with Legal-Zagazi before turning on him too, absorbing his city into a growing empire that had no intention of stopping. He was the first ruler in history to maintain a standing army whose sole purpose was soldiering. Most other armies at the time were made up of farmers and craftsmen who had to return home for the harvest. You could raid, but you couldn't campaign indefinitely. Sargon broke that limitation. Ancient sources claim he fed 5,400 men at his table daily, and with them, he built what we now call the first empire in history. Sargon would reign for more than 50 years, which was one of the longest reigns in the ancient world. According to surviving historical tablets, including the Chronicle of Early Kings, he possessed no rival and stood entirely undefeated. On the Nippur tablet, scribes recorded the flawless legacy originally etched into his victory stele, declaring 34 battles fought during his bloody conquest of Mesopotamia, 34 victories. That kind of longevity and that kind of record gave him something most conquerors never get, which is time. He used that time to standardise weights and measures across every culture the empire touched, creating the first unified economic system in history. The cubit, the length of the forearm from elbow to fingertip, became the empire's measuring stick. 6 cubits made a reed, and from there the reed itself was strung out into a cord, used for surveying fields and laying out canals across the empire. Weight was the same deal. The shekel sat at the centre. 60 of them made a mina, 60 minas made a talent. Clean ratios, consistent values verified against actual trade goods. You couldn't cheat the scales if the scales were the same in Akkad as they were in Sumer. In one of the most famous ancient texts, the Curse of Akkad, the poem describes goods flowing in from every direction, From the steppe Matu people, bringing in cattle, to the Milohans, who were likely Indus Valley traders carrying exotic wares, to Elam and Suber, who loaded themselves with goods as if they were pack asses. It paints Akkad as the centre of the world, with everything flowing toward it. He also used his time on the throne to place his people, build his roads, and make Akkad the centre of gravity for an entire world. No one had done any of it before. There was no blueprint to go off of. He wrote the blueprint. But one thing most conquerors forget to plan for is what happens when you actually die. Sargon died around 2279 BCE, somewhere in his 80s, in his bed, which by ancient standards is practically a fairy tale ending. His son Rimus took the throne, and within months the empire he had inherited was on fire. Sumerian cities he had grown up thinking of as conquered territory decided the old man's death meant the deal was off. Rimus spent his entire reign putting down revolt after revolt. It didn't buy him much time. Soon Rimus was murdered by his own courtiers, beaten to death, tradition says, with their heavy stone cylinder seals. But worth being straight with you here. That detail comes from a text written from the old Babylonian omen tablets more than 1,000 years after Rimus died. What we can say with more confidence is that he was dead after roughly 9 years on the throne, and that his brother Manistusu stepped into the vacancy. Manistusu lasted 15 years, ran his own campaigns, and then by most later accounts was killed the same way, a palace conspiracy. 2 sons, 2 kings, and 2 assassinations. An empire only 1 generation old, and it already couldn't hand power from one man to the next without someone ending up dead. One might say, a tale as old as time. Manistusu's son was next in line, and his name was Naram Sin. And he took everything Sargon and his sons had built and pushed it further, militarily, politically, and also in terms of sheer audacity. He was the first Mesopotamian ruler to declare himself a god during his own lifetime. Not a man favoured by the gods, not a king appointed by the gods, an actual god. And he had it inscribed in his name. His name was written as Naram Sin, with the divine determinative, a cuneiform sign meaning God, placed in the front of it. So every time someone wrote his name, they were literally writing God, Naram Sin. Humility might not have been his strongest suit, but his ambition was unmatched. The victory stele of Naram Sin, carved around 2254 BCE, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of military art to survive from the ancient world. Most victory monuments of this era are flat, rigid, and organised in neat horizontal registers, with ranks of soldiers, rows of enemies, and everything orderly. The Naram Sin stele is none of these things. It's dynamic, diagonal, and feels like it's happening rather than being recorded. Naram Sin himself looms large at the top, wearing a horned helmet, the mark of divinity, trampling a fallen enemy with his spear raised, other enemies tumbling broken down the slope of the mountain beneath him. It is a piece of deliberate visual propaganda, and it's brilliant. You look at it and you feel the victory rather than simply reading about it. Naram Sin's ambition didn't go unchallenged though. A massive rebellion broke out under a Sumerian rebel named Lugalene, serious enough to put the empire's grip on the south back in doubt, and it caught someone in the family in the blast radius. Enheduanna, Sargon's own daughter, had spent decades as High Priestess of the most powerful religious post in the empire, placed there specifically to weld Sumerian and Akkadian religion together and keep the south from tearing itself loose. She is, as far as we can tell, the first author in human history whose name survives attached to her own work. A fact historians love to put at the front page and then say almost nothing else about. Legalane threw her out, stripped her of her priesthood and drove her from the temple, took the title that had defined her entire adult life. And somewhere in that exile, with the empire her father had built looking shakier than it had ever had, Enheduanna sat down and wrote her way back. The poem is called The Exaltation of Inanna, Inanna being the goddess of war and desire. It is 153 lines written in the first person, and it is not a polite temple hymn. It is a woman stripped of her office and unsure her father's empire would survive out the year, begging her goddess directly for help and not hiding how she felt. Quote, I, the high priestess, I, Enheduanna, my hand no longer grasps the ritual basket. I am driven from the temple like a swallow flying from its window. Funeral offerings were brought as if I had never lived. An admission that her enemies had just exiled her. They were trying to legally and spiritually erase her. Enheduanna demands justice. She openly complains when the moon god Nana ignores her, and she challenges Inanna to make a statement. Let it be known that you are lofty as the heavens, and let it be known that you are as broad as the earth. Let it be known that you destroy the rebel lands. Her prayers were answered, and Naram Sin crushed Legalane's rebellion, and the rest who had risen with him. And Enheduanna got her temple back. She held that position for around 40 years all told, and after her death, the Sumerians did something they didn't do for ordinary priestesses. They kept venerating her as a minor deity in her own right. Her poems outlived her, outlived the empire, outlived the language it was written in, and sat buried, unread for 4,000 years until archaeologists dug it back up in the 20th century. The first named author in history, and for most of human history, nobody even knew her name. Naram Sin's military campaigns stretched the empire to its greatest extent, deep into what is now Iran, south of the Arabian Peninsula, and north towards the Taurus Mountains. He fought on multiple fronts simultaneously and won. By any measure, Naram Sin was one of the most effective military minds of the ancient world. And then at the height of it all, Naram Sin had a dream, or more accurately, we might call it a nightmare. In the Curse of Akkad, we are told of this vision. Enlil, god of wind, air and storms, but more importantly the god of kingship and fate, made his intentions clear. He would not let the kingdoms of Akkad occupy a pleasant, lasting residence. He would make its future altogether unfavourable, make its temples shake, and scatter its treasures. Naram Sin understood what the dream meant, but he kept it to himself. The most powerful man on earth was alone with the dream he couldn't speak out loud. But Naram Sin didn't just wait for the gods to act. He gathered his forces and descended upon the spiritual centre of his own kingdom, the famous city of Nippur, home of the god Enlil. The place that had legitimised every king before him, a sacred neutral ground that no ruler had ever dared touch, he put his axes to the walls anyway, stripped its gold, and packed its silver into leather bags and loaded the lot onto boats. He didn't ransack a foreign temple, he robbed his own gods, and Enlil noticed. And his wrath would come in the form of the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains to the east, later described as the fanged snake of the mountain ranges, who came down out of the highlands and did what mountain peoples have done to lowland empires throughout history. They didn't fight on the terms of the Akkadians. They raided and disrupted and bled the empire from the edges. If the Akkadians tried to move their slow, cumbersome forces to meet the threat, they would just withdraw and pop up some other place to harass and cause chaos. Supply lines began to fail, and the provincial governors lost their confidence in the empire. The administrative machine that had held the empire together began to seize up and break down. Now quoting from the Curse of Akkad. May the grass of morning grow on your highways, laid for wagons. In your plains where the fine grass grew, now the reeds of lamentation will grow. Akkad's flowing fresh water flowed now as brackish water. Those who lay down on the roof died on the roof, and those who lay down in the house were not buried. Dogs were packed together in the silent streets. If two men walked there, they would be devoured by them. This was Akkad. This was what Naram Sin had built, and what the gods, or history, or maybe hubris, had undone. The Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2154 BCE, within a generation of its greatest height. It is one of the most dramatic falls in all of ancient history. But we can't just point the finger at the Gutians here. This is only part of the story, and maybe even just a symptom of a greater problem that was already underway. Scientists call this problem the 4.2 Kiloyear Event, a 3-century mega-drought that turned Mesopotamia's breadbasket to dust. It is a climate event of such significance that geologists still use it to mark the end of the North Gryphian Age and the start of our current Megalian Age. While scientists today debate exactly how widespread this climate shift truly was, for the people of the Akkadian Empire who lived along the Tigris and Euphrates, the crisis was devastatingly real. You can survive a few bad years, maybe even a decade, but 3 centuries of drought will collapse almost any empire. When you can't feed your population, maintain your army, or secure your supply lines from attack, it's only a matter of time. So what do we have left of the once great city of Akkad? Well, after more than a century of looking, nobody has found it. The most important city of the Bronze Age, the place which every road in Mesopotamia was built to lead toward, is gone so completely that archaeologists still argue over which side of the Euphrates it was even on. But more importantly, what we do have is everything they pioneered while Akkad still reigned. The standing army, the postal service, the weights and measures system, and the first formation of an empire. That didn't disappear when the city did. Every empire after Sargon was in one way or another running his software. You can erase a city, but the blueprint for how to build an empire had now been written, and it would always belong to the king of the universe, Sargon of Akkad, and the mighty Akkadians.